Welcome, friends, to another edition of Global Economic Lens, where we take a closer look at the forces shaping our world and sometimes reshaping it in silence. I'm your host, and as always, I thank you for joining us. Before we begin, a quick reminder. Our next live forum on the future of work in the age of tariffs will stream this Thursday evening, followed by a new lecture series on global supply chains and the politics of protectionism. And yes, my latest book, Factories Without Borders, is now available for pre-order. Now, let's turn to today's story, one that may not make the evening headlines, but will define the next decade of industrial power. Something unusual is unfolding across North America's industrial landscape. It isn't loud. It isn't dramatic. There are no breaking news alerts or triumphant speeches. Instead, there's a quiet, deliberate withdrawal, a movement of capital, skill, and patience led by Japan's most respected car makers, the same companies that for decades symbolized cooperation between Asia and the United States. Toyota, Honda, Subaru, Mazda are quietly redrawing the map. The reason? A new reality in Washington. The incoming Trump administration has promised to bring manufacturing home to restore America's industrial pride through a mix of tariffs, trade revisions, and America First economics. But as history often reminds us, good intentions can have strange consequences. The goal was to strengthen American industry. The result may instead weaken it and empower its neighbors. Let's begin with a snapshot. Japan's auto industry is one of the most sophisticated in the world. It's not just about cars, it's about ecosystems, suppliers, logistics, research centers, and workers who together form a living network of production. For decades, that network stretched across the Pacific, connecting Tokyo to Detroit, Yokohama to Indiana. But today, that connection is under strain. When Donald Trump signaled new tariffs, 25% on steel and aluminum, up to 49% on imported vehicles, Japan's automakers didn't panic. They planned. In boardrooms across Tokyo and Nagoya, executives realized that the cost of uncertainty had become higher than the cost of relocation. Within months, a quiet migration began. Subaru, once proud of its Lafayette, Indiana plant, the birthplace of its best-selling Outback, announced it would halt production for Canada's market. The reason was simple arithmetic. Ottawa's free trade deal with Japan shielded it from the tariff storm. Washington's did not. That announcement in early 2025 was more than a corporate adjustment. It was a message and perhaps a warning. The global economy is allergic to unpredictability. Investors, engineers, and entire industries survive on trust in the rules of the game. When those rules change overnight, they move their pieces elsewhere. Subaru's decision to cut U.S.-Canada exports by more than half in a single year was only the first domino. Behind the numbers lies something larger. Vehicles make up over a quarter of Japan's exports to the United States. Nearly 1 in 12 Japanese jobs depends on that trade. Now, those exports face tariffs that make each car nearly 50% more expensive. Factories run slower, suppliers lose contracts. Some shut down entirely. A small manufacturer in Nagoya recently told Nikkei, "We've survived earthquakes and recessions, but this uncertainty is harder to rebuild from." And yet, amid this economic pain, another pattern emerges. Japan's automakers are not retreating from North America. They are reorganizing it. The movement northward toward Canada is quiet but decisive. Ontario, with its stable regulations, open trade policy, and access to both Atlantic and U.S. markets, has become what economists call a safe harbor zone. Japanese investment there is rising sharply, echoing a time long past the 1980 seconds when similar trade barriers pushed Toyota and Honda to open plants in Canada instead of the United States. So here we are again. 40 years later, a familiar story unfolds, but on a bigger stage. Trump's protectionism, intended to revive the American auto industry, may be steering it toward decline. By making imported parts more expensive and foreign partners less certain, Washington risks driving the very production it wants to reclaim into the arms of others. Before we jump deeper into the economic mechanics, the numbers, the trade flows, the strategic decisions, let's pause and consider the symbolism. The auto industry has always been a mirror of national ambition. It's about more than cars. It's about power, trust, and continuity. When Japan moves its production north, it's not abandoning America. It's reading the signs of the times. And those signs, for now, point to a country that values political spectacle over economic strategy. Let's move deeper into the story. Because what's happening now between Washington, Tokyo, and Ottawa is not just a trade dispute. It's a structural shift, a rewriting of how global manufacturing decides where to call home. To understand that shift, we have to start with one word: tariffs. They sound technical, even dull, but they are the modern world's economic weapon of choice. And like most weapons, they tend to injure the hand that wields them. Under the Trump administration, tariffs on imported vehicles, parts, and raw materials were meant to force companies back to American soil to make them build here, hire here, pay here. In theory, it sounded patriotic. In practice, it has been catastrophic. Let's look at the math. The United States imports roughly $180 billion in vehicles and auto parts every year. Japan alone accounts for more than $40 billion of that total. When Washington imposed tariffs up to 25% on components and as high as 49% on finished vehicles, the cost structure of the entire industry was shaken. For a company like Toyota, that meant billions in added expenses before a single car even left the factory. Analysts estimate that Japanese automakers lost around $25 a billion last year due to these measures, and Toyota bore nearly half of that burden. Now, that might sound like a victory for American industry. After all, if imports become more expensive, doesn't that make U.S.-made cars more competitive? It should, if the U.S. still built enough of them. But the reality is far more tangled. Roughly 40% of the parts used in American-made vehicles actually come from abroad, from Japan, South Korea, Mexico, and increasingly from Canada. That means when tariffs strike foreign suppliers, they strike domestic factories too. The cost of every brake pad, battery, and steel panel climbs, and when those costs rise, either the company absorbs them, cutting wages or investment, or the consumer does, paying thousands more for the same car. In other words, the tariff that was supposed to punish Japan has instead punished Detroit. It's called economic whiplash, and it's spreading fast. Let's not forget the human side of this equation. In Japan, hundreds of small and medium-sized suppliers, the hidden backbone of the auto industry, are struggling to stay afloat. These aren't global giants. They're family-run companies employing dozens or hundreds of workers. Their contracts with U.S. assemblers have vanished overnight. As one supplier told Asahi Shimbun, "We built trust for 30 years, and it collapsed with one signature." Across Japan, estimates suggest as many as 150,000 jobs could be affected directly or indirectly by the tariff fallout. Meanwhile, in the United States, workers are being told the opposite story. They're told that tariffs will bring jobs home, that factories will reopen, that America's industrial greatness will return. It's a compelling story until you check the numbers. Manufacturing employment has stagnated, and the cost of U.S. assembled vehicles has risen faster than inflation. Sales have dropped. Consumers are holding back. The very middle class families that Trump promised to protect are now paying more for less. And so companies adapt. Subaru's decision to end production of the Outback in Indiana was only the first ripple. Toyota and Honda are quietly expanding their hybrid and electric vehicle facilities not in Ohio or Tennessee, but in Ontario. Mazda and Mitsubishi are relocating logistics and R&D hubs to Toronto. Why? Because Canada offers what the United States no longer guarantees: stability, predictable rules, consistent trade policy, and an open relationship with Japan through the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP. By staying in Canada, Japanese automakers can access the entire North American market without getting caught in tariff crossfire. They can export freely to the U.S., the EU, and Asia, a privilege that American firms under Trump's fractured trade regime no longer enjoy. This is the irony of protectionism. It's supposed to make a nation stronger by closing its doors, but the global economy doesn't wait for politics to settle. It moves around obstacles like water finding a new channel. Each time Washington raises a wall, industry finds a detour, and increasingly that detour ends in Canada. Now, some might call this a short-term adjustment, a temporary reaction to political turbulence, but history says otherwise. In the early 1980 seconds, President Ronald Reagan imposed what was called a voluntary export restraint on Japanese cars, capping imports and functioning like a tariff of 60%. Japan responded not with retaliation, but with relocation. Honda opened its first Canadian plant in 1984. Toyota followed in 1986. The result? Canada's economy revived while the U.S. watched production and jobs quietly cross the border. Today, that story repeats itself, but with electric engines and global supply chains at stake. Ontario, once the heart of North America's steel and auto corridor, is becoming a sanctuary. Again, a safe space for long-term industrial planning. Japanese capital is pouring in. New investments exceed $14 billion. Thousands of new jobs have been created, not in Michigan or Indiana, but in Cambridge and Alliston. That's the paradox we live in. A government that claims to defend domestic industry has made it too expensive to produce domestically, and a neighboring country, by simply remaining predictable, becomes the beneficiary of America's volatility. Before jumping in, let's recall one simple truth about capitalism. It follows the path of least resistance. It seeks profit, not patriotism. And when political turbulence makes one market costly, it flows to another. That's exactly what's happening now in the North American auto industry. The quiet exodus of Japanese automakers from the United States is not rebellion. It's adaptation, rational, strategic, and entirely predictable. To grasp how far this has gone, let's look at Ontario, Canada. Cities like Alliston, Woodstock, and Cambridge, once modest manufacturing towns, have become industrial hubs again. They hum with the sound of robotic assembly lines and Japanese management systems. As of this year, Ontario hosts 7 Japanese automotive plants, 5 producing light vehicles, 1 building engines, and another focused on trucks. Together, they sustain about 30,000 direct jobs and far more in logistics, parts, and maintenance. Now, here's the twist. The economic revival of these Canadian communities is built not on new inventions, but on American policy errors. When Washington raised tariffs on steel and aluminum, it made building a car in the U.S. significantly more expensive. Every bolt, every frame, every imported chip now costs more. Even cars built domestically depend on an average of 40-50% imported components. Those tariffs added roughly $2,400 to the average sticker price of a U.S.-made car. For consumers already burdened by inflation, that's the equivalent of an extra month's rent. And so, as American factories struggled to stay competitive, Japan's automakers made their move. Toyota expanded its Cambridge plant to produce new hybrid models. Honda added a second battery line to support electric vehicle production. Mazda and Mitsubishi relocated their R&D divisions to Toronto's growing technology corridor. Why? Because Canada, through the CPTPP trade framework, maintains free trade with Japan. No tariffs, no surprises, no nightly tweets rewriting policy. It's a powerful reminder that trust, not tariffs, is what sustains global business. Japan's corporations are famously risk-averse. They plan decades ahead. When the U.S. became unpredictable, Canada became the logical choice. Ottawa's consistency, combined with open access to both U.S. and Asian markets, gave it what economists now call policy credibility premium. Meanwhile, across the border, American plants are cutting shifts. Subaru's closure of the Outback line in Indiana sent shockwaves through its local economy. Suppliers that once shipped directly to that factory are either downsizing or relocating north as well. The ripple effect is enormous. Every auto assembly job supports roughly 7 others in materials, logistics, dealerships, and services. When production moves, those livelihoods move too. Let's be clear, this isn't a story about Japan abandoning America. It's about the fragility of an economic system that treats predictability as expendable. Corporations, after all, make decisions not out of loyalty, but out of logic. A company cannot operate when policy changes every few months, when tariffs are imposed one week and lifted the next, when trade partners are treated as bargaining chips. And here lies the political hypocrisy. The Trump administration calls these tariffs a return to American strength. But the numbers tell another story. Manufacturing's share of U.S. GDP has continued to decline. The trade deficit in automobiles has widened. And despite all the patriotic slogans, the real beneficiaries of America First policies are foreign competitors who learn to operate smarter, not louder. In Japan, executives speak softly but move decisively. In Canada, policymakers act slowly but steadily. In Washington, speeches come faster than strategies. The result? The balance of industrial power tilts north and east, not toward the America of factory towns and unions, but toward the pragmatic economies that quietly fill the gaps left behind. Here's what that means for ordinary people. For American consumers, higher car prices are now the new normal. For Canadian workers, new jobs and apprenticeships are returning. And for Japanese suppliers, Canada is the bridge that keeps them connected to the North American market without being trapped by U.S. politics. But the deeper story lies beneath those numbers. This shift reveals a global truth. Economic trust is now as valuable as natural resources. Nations that maintain stable rules attract the industries of the future: electric vehicles, green batteries, and advanced robotics. Nations that weaponize trade policy lose them. Take the electric vehicle transition. Japan's automakers are now linking their EV production with Canada's mineral wealth, lithium from Ontario, nickel and cobalt from Quebec. That synergy creates what analysts call a clean energy corridor connecting Asia and North America. It's not just about cars anymore. It's about who controls the next generation of mobility, batteries, and technology supply chains. The irony is almost poetic. The United States wanted to dominate the EV revolution. Instead, its own tariffs are pushing innovation just beyond its borders. Canada, by staying open and reliable, has become the silent winner. Japan, by staying strategic, has become the quiet architect of this new order. Don't be fooled by the calm headlines. What's unfolding here is not a temporary market shuffle. It's a structural reset. Power in global manufacturing is migrating toward those who understand patience, partnership, and policy stability. And it tells us something larger about the world we live in. Those who weaponize trade will soon discover that commerce, like history, always finds a way around walls. Now let's move to the deeper layer of this story, the political and moral dimension behind the economics. Because the migration of Japan's automakers northward is not only about factories and tariffs, it's about the global erosion of trust in American leadership. For decades, Japan and the United States represented one of the world's most successful industrial partnerships, from the 1,980 seconds through the 2,010 seconds. Their relationship was built on a simple understanding. Japan brought precision and discipline. America brought scale and market power. Together, they made cars that defined modern quality. The Toyota Camry, the Honda Accord, symbols of middle-class life, born from a cross-Pacific alliance that balanced efficiency with ambition. But that partnership required predictability. When trade becomes a political theater, when tweets replace treaties, corporations begin to drift. And that drift is exactly what we are witnessing today. Under Trump's renewed America First doctrine, economic nationalism has replaced economic planning. Tariffs are no longer tools of negotiation. They are instruments of identity. The White House describes them as weapons of fairness. Yet fairness in practice has been defined as punishment. Punishment for allies, punishment for competitors, even punishment for domestic producers caught in the crossfire. Let's recall, Japan is not China. It is not accused of currency manipulation or industrial espionage. It is, by every measure, a democratic ally, a major investor, and a partner in North American manufacturing. And yet, it finds itself treated as a rival to be contained. The irony could not be sharper. Washington's tariffs meant to isolate adversaries have instead alienated allies. Meanwhile, Ottawa saw the opening. Rather than lecturing global partners, Canada invited them. It didn't raise walls, it built frameworks. It joined and strengthened the CPTPP, maintaining open trade with Japan even as the U.S. withdrew. It negotiated investment protection clauses, ensuring that companies could plan long-term without fear of sudden policy reversals. That stability, that quiet competence is paying off. The result? Canada has become, as one Tokyo analyst put it, the Switzerland of North American manufacturing, neutral in tone, reliable in policy, and rich in the very minerals, lithium, nickel, cobalt, that define the future of transportation. Japan's automakers didn't just move to save money, they moved to safeguard continuity. They moved to a country where tomorrow still looks like today. Here's the paradox. Trump's tariffs were meant to force Japan to build in the U.S., but by making American operations more expensive, he achieved the opposite. The so-called rebirth of American manufacturing became the rebirth of Canadian industry. In Ontario alone, Japanese automakers have already invested over $14.6 billion, with new expansions planned through 2026. That's money, technology, and expertise, once destined for America's heartland, now strengthening its neighbor instead. And it doesn't stop there. European and South Korean automakers are taking notes. Hyundai, Volkswagen, and BMW have all begun exploring joint ventures in Canada to produce electric vehicles and batteries. They see what Japan saw first, a landscape where the rule of law, not the rule of personality, defines trade. The political lesson is painful but necessary. Protectionism often starts as a promise to the working class. It ends as a subsidy to inefficiency. By trying to freeze globalization through tariffs, the U.S. has merely redirected it. Globalization doesn't disappear, it migrates. The factories don't vanish, they cross borders. Let's not forget what history teaches us. In the 1,930 seconds, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act was passed under a similar slogan, protect American jobs. Instead, it deepened the Great Depression, collapsing exports by more than half and triggering retaliatory measures worldwide. Then, as now, political isolation was sold as national strength, and then, as now, it produced economic weakness. So here we are again, the same pattern, the same mistake, only the names have changed. Washington calls it decoupling. Economists call it self-inflicted isolation. The world calls it an opportunity. And yet, there's an irony that demands reflection. Even as Trump claims to rebuild American manufacturing, his policies depend on the very foreign investment he condemns. The new factories that still open on U.S. soil in Alabama, in Texas, are mostly funded by Japan, Korea, and Germany. The United States no longer builds alone. It borrows the confidence of others. That's the real contradiction. A country that declares independence while depending on foreign capital to fulfill its industrial dream, it's a paradox at the heart of modern capitalism, one that exposes how slogans can hide dependence and how nationalism can mask weakness. In a sense, Japan's retreat is not just a reaction, it's a verdict. It tells us that the world no longer trusts America to stay consistent, and that verdict carries consequences beyond trade. It affects alliances, currency stability, and even the global balance of democratic influence. Let's take a step back and look at the larger picture, not from the factory floor, but from the altitude of history. Because what we're witnessing today between Japan, the United States, and Canada isn't just an industrial reshuffle. It's a civilizational moment, a quiet referendum on which kind of capitalism, chaotic or consistent, will define the next global era. The migration of Japan's automakers northward tells a deeper story about values. In the United States, economic policy has become performative, driven by headlines, slogans, and electoral theater. Make America Great Again was supposed to revive domestic industry. But behind the applause lines, no structural vision was ever offered. No national industrial policy no long-term planning for supply chains or technology transitions. Instead, tariffs became the substitute for strategy, and tariffs, by their nature, don't build. They block, they can slow imports, but they can't create innovation. They can penalize rivals, but they can't train workers. They can make political noise, but they don't produce a single new idea. So while Washington turned protectionism into spectacle, Ottawa and Tokyo quietly invested in infrastructure, education, and energy systems that actually sustain manufacturing. That's the contrast worth reflecting on. Canada didn't shout about economic sovereignty. It practiced it by diversifying trade agreements, strengthening energy cooperation, and linking itself to Asia's industrial supply chains. Japan, instead of responding with retaliation, responded with redirection, reconfiguring its production model toward partners that still believe in stable capitalism. Together, they've created something new, a bilateral industrial ecosystem that stretches from Nagoya's assembly plants to Ontario's battery corridors. Now, think about what that means for the global order. The traditional axis of production, US-Japan, is quietly becoming Japan-Canada. The political rhetoric of America first has birthed an economic geography of America bypassed. And with every year that tariffs stay in place, that bypass becomes a highway. But there's another dimension, a moral one, because at its core, this is a story about trust or the loss of it. The world doesn't simply trade in goods. It trades in predictability. When investors believe a country will keep its word, they stay. When they fear the rules will change overnight, they leave. In this new era, trust itself has become a currency, and the United States is spending it faster than it can earn it. Don't be fooled by the short-term optics. Yes, a few plants may reopen. Yes, some politicians will cut ribbons in front of new facilities funded by foreign investors. But the deeper current flows elsewhere. The real capital, the innovation, the R&D, the strategic planning is migrating to environments that value stability over showmanship. That's where the future lives now. In Canada, that stability has become a quiet magnet. You can see it in the growing alliance between Japan's automotive and Canada's resource sectors. Lithium from Quebec meets Toyota's battery designs. Nickel from Ontario powers Honda's next generation of hybrids. Subaru engineers in Tokyo collaborate with AI developers in Toronto. It's the kind of cross-border synergy that the United States once championed but now watches from the sidelines. Here's the painful irony. Protectionism, sold as economic independence, has delivered economic dependence. By isolating itself, Washington has made its industries more reliant on others to fill the gaps. It has taught allies to cooperate, just not with America. And that lesson will echo long after Trump leaves office. History has a way of humbling nations that mistake size for strength. The British Empire once believed its tariffs could preserve dominance. They instead accelerated its decline. In the 1,980 seconds, Reagan's export restraints gave Japan its first foothold in North America. And today, Trump's tariffs are giving Canada its renaissance. The pattern is unmistakable. Protectionism protects no one. Before we close, let's reflect on what this all means for democracy itself. An economy built on predictability sustains civic confidence. One built on chaos corrodes it. When governments treat trade as warfare and allies as enemies, they feed the very cynicism that undermines democracy. Citizens lose faith that rational policy is even possible. And once faith erodes, institutions follow. So, as Japan's automakers quietly drive north, perhaps they're not just seeking cheaper costs. Perhaps they're seeking a kind of political sanity, a place where the rules of cooperation still mean something. In that sense, their migration is not just economic, it's symbolic. It tells us which societies are still capable of long-term thinking and which are trapped in the theater of short-term politics. In the end, this story is less about cars than about direction, about which nations are steering towards sustainability and which are stuck in reverse. Canada and Japan have chosen predictability, partnership, and patience, the long road. The United States, for now, seems addicted to shortcuts, but every detour has a destination. And if America doesn't correct its course, it may soon find that the world it tried to dominate has quietly learned to move without it. Thank you for joining us. I look forward to speaking with you again next week.